In this video, I'm going to give a real quick recap or a real quick summary of the problem of evil and of one crucial distinction that's going to be important for replying to the problem of evil. And that's the distinction between natural and moral evil. So let's get down to it. The problem of evil is a problem for theism. If you've watched the earlier video about the attributes of God according to theism, you'll know that theism is the view that a God exists, but a God of a particular kind. A God that is omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent. There we go. All-knowing, all-good, and all-powerful. As we'll see, those assumptions are crucial for getting the problem of evil off the ground. The problem of evil is basically the claim that God can't exist because evil exists. The argument goes, evil exists. If the God of theism existed, then there would be no evil, so that God must not exist. Okay, and as we'll see, it's crucial to the argument that you assume that God is omniscient, omnibenevolent, and omnipotent. I'll get that one eventually. Okay, so the argument, I think the strongest kind of consensus view is it's the strongest argument against God's existence. That doesn't mean that God doesn't exist. It just means if there's a case to be made, it's probably going to hinge on this argument. It certainly would help if I could switch slides. There we go. So here's a couple of pictures for you. The right-hand one might be familiar to you, maybe not by looking at it, but this is a picture of the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey. I believe that was 2017? I am blanking on it now. At any rate, this is the aftermath. These were all buildings, and they've all been totally wiped away, except for one, weirdly enough. But as you know, a bunch of people died in Harvey. I looked it up. I think it's 39 people died as a result of Hurricane Harvey. Probably almost all in Houston, although Harvey hit rural areas equally hard. It's just that they weren't population centers, so they didn't get the press that Houston got. Anyway, 39 people died as a result of Harvey, and that does not count all of the non-death suffering and evil that resulted from it. Many homes were destroyed. A lot of homes were destroyed that people didn't have insurance, which of course makes it worse. It doesn't make it okay when you do have insurance. It's still a horrible thing to lose your home and many of your possessions. It was of course a horrible experience during it. People lost electrical and water and all sorts of things. It was a bad time. There was much evil and suffering in the world because of Hurricane Harvey. On the left-hand side, there's a picture of something you might be less acquainted with. This is a picture of Ukraine in, I believe, 1933 during an event that was called, or that has come to be called, the Holodomor. The Holodomor was a genocide. Well, it's disputed whether it was a genocide because it's disputed whether it was wholly intentional. And it's also disputed how many people died as a result of it because this was part of the Soviet Union. The records are murky. Lots of things were hidden or records were destroyed. But scholars generally agree that it was at least several million people that died. Some estimates are as high as 15 million, but the scholarly consensus centers around 3 to 7 million people died. What happened? Well, Ukraine is sort of the breadbasket of the former USSR. There's lots of farming in Ukraine. It's a very fertile region, but when the Soviet Union came to power, this is sort of the bird's eye view of it. I don't know a lot of the details, and a lot of the details are disputed, but the Soviet Union centralized a lot of the planning about farming, and as a result, a bunch of millions of people died of starvation in the Holodomor in a country or in a region that is incredibly fertile. And in fact, I think there are many cases where people were killed for eating food that was there to be eaten, but they weren't allowed to eat it. It's disputed whether the Holodomor was intentional. Many scholars believe that Stalin did it on purpose in order to suppress a Ukrainian independence movement. And at any rate, it was, at the very least, it was the result of deep human failing because on even the best, most charitable interpretation, the Holodomor, millions of people died as a result of human inefficiency, as a result of the choice, at the very least, to adopt a horrible political system that ended up killing millions because it tried to re-engineer society, a society that was functioning and feeding people in one of the most fertile regions in the area. So it's almost a moral indictment of the political system if it wasn't intentional, right? Because then it's a result of the system, the political system itself, as opposed to Stalin being a maniacal person and killing millions in order to suppress an independence movement. At any rate, what distinguishes these two cases? What distinguishes these two cases? Well, let's not talk about that yet. Let's talk about what's had the two cases have in common. You might see a difference between them, but let's back up and look at what they have in common. What they have in common is deep, horrible human suffering. Maybe to the point, in some cases, we would call it evil. We'll talk about how we're going to define evil here, but deep suffering. On the one hand, on the left-hand side, obviously, in far greater numbers than on the right-hand side, but that doesn't minimize the right-hand side. Still, great human suffering as a result of these two events. And a lot of people look at events like this and they say, how is it that there could be a God that allows this sort of thing to happen? Why, for example, did God not step in and stop Stalin from committing a genocide, if that's what happened? Or why didn't, if it wasn't what happened, why didn't he come in and make the system more efficient or prevent the USSR from ever coming into existence and adopting a political system that failed and failed horribly in a way that resulted in millions and millions of deaths? And this is just one event, and it's millions of deaths. Why didn't God step in and reroute this hurricane back into the ocean, right? Why didn't he do it? Or why didn't he? You could think about this in multiple ways, right? God could intervene in nature directly. This is one of the background assumptions of this worry, is that, well, God surely has the ability to intervene in nature and do things supernaturally. You could call them miracles, that he is defying the laws of nature or breaking the laws of nature or constituting an exception to the laws of nature in order to do something in the world. And he could have done that in this case, even though the laws of nature would have dictated that Hurricane Harvey came straight towards Houston. He could have just reached down, so to speak, metaphorically, and rerouted it. And on the other hand, he could have, as the Gospels say of Jesus, multiplied bread in the case of Ukraine and kept people from starving. Why didn't he do it? Why did he not do it if he exists and has the ability? So that's one way you can think about this, as God. The argument is that God should have the ability to intervene in nature and do miraculous things if he exists. So why isn't he doing them? Another way you could think about it, if you don't even have to commit to the existence of miracles even to get the problem going, because presumably God set up, well, not presumably, this is a commitment of theism. When God created the world, he created it in a certain way. He could have created it in a different way, right? So think of it as billiard balls or a pool table, right? When the balls are set up a certain way and you hit the ball towards another ball in a certain way, there's only one thing that can happen. But if you're the person setting up the balls on the pool table and deciding which ball to aim at and how hard to hit it and things like that, you could change the outcome, right? That's the whole beauty of pool. It wouldn't be exciting if you couldn't do that. And similarly, people will say, well, look, God doesn't even have to intervene miraculously in the world. He set up the world. He could have set it up differently. Why did he have to set it up such that hurricanes would come into population centers like that? If hurricanes are necessary for the world, why didn't he set it up so that they just hang out in the ocean or, whatever, do laps around the Atlantic Ocean or something? And so that doesn't involve him even reaching down into a world that's moving. So it's actually friendly to deism, the view that God exists, and he has these traits that we talked about, these attributes, but he does not actively intervene in the world after its creation. So even if you're a deist, you've got a problem here, because you think surely he could have set it up so that hurricanes wouldn't happen. Surely he could have set it up so that, things like the Holodomor couldn't happen, although that's a little more difficult, as we'll see. So that's the problem. That's the problem of evil. We'll talk about it in a little bit more detail, but you can see the force of it. Even if you're a theist, even if you believe in God, even if you're very religious, you can see the force of it, right? How could God do this? How could he allow this? Not that he's done it, but he's at least allowed it to happen. And we'll talk about why that's jarring, because let's talk about it. Well, we'll reference it now. We'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. It's jarring because if you're committed to theism, as most of the major monotheistic religions of the world are, you have to think that God has the power to prevent evil. He can do anything. He's all powerful. It's not the case that he's ignorant of evil. He knows everything. He knew that these things were happening. And if he existed, he's perfectly good. So he would want to eliminate evil, right? So how is it that evil still occurs when a being exists that can eliminate it, that knows about it, and wants to eliminate it? Surely such a being would eliminate it. And so since it exists, such a being cannot exist simultaneously with evil. Okay, so let's talk about this distinction, what these cases don't have in common, what distinguishes them. In the case of Harvey, what you might have seen, if you're kind of catching on here, is that Harvey doesn't seem to be the result of any person's actions, unless it's God's, but we're going to leave that out for a second. Harvey seemed to happen regardless of what, no one decided to start Harvey out in the ocean and push it towards Houston, right? On the other hand, it looks like we said, regardless of whether you think it was Stalin who intentionally did it or whether it was a result of a political system, it's still the result of people doing things in the world. If it weren't for people making certain decisions, the Holodomor never would have occurred. So we've got this distinction between moral and natural evil. Moral is evil that results from the intentional action of persons, not necessarily human persons. Person here just means an agent capable of intentional action. So it could be an angel, it could be a demon or something like that. That'll be important when we talk about the free will defense. And natural evil is just an evil that doesn't result from the intentional action of persons. Now, let's talk about the word evil real quick. So we don't mean here necessarily that evil is like, the way we typically use evil, we only apply it to moral evils. This is an unfortunate aspect of the way the debate has occurred. We really should be talking about moral and natural suffering, right? What we mean here is an evil is just a bad thing, really, that's happening. So we don't mean, normally the way we talk about evil, people have to be evil. There are no, like, the sun is not evil. When it, scorches my skin in all of 7 minutes of sitting outside in, late February when it gets to be 65 degrees and my legs see the sun for the first time in 4 months. The sun is not evil for that, but it has caused some suffering. And the way we're using evil here is to encompass all of that. There is evil in the world as a result of my fragile skin being sunburnt by the sun. So there's evil because there's suffering. That's not to imply that the sun did it on purpose, although sometimes it feels that way. Okay, so that's our big distinction. And let's get the argument. It's a very simple argument on the board. If God existed, he would eliminate all evil. We saw that is supported by the claims that God has the traits of omniscience, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. Evil exists, therefore God does not exist. That is the problem of evil. It is simple, but it is powerful. We will stop there for now.